For 3 decades, Johnny Carson invited America into his living room. Every night, the world's most famous people sat just a few feet away from him, smiling, laughing, pretending their lives were perfect. But behind the charm and the easy banter, Carson saw what the public could not: the fear, the secrets, the quiet pain hidden beneath Hollywood's polished surface. As he grew older, the weight of what he knew began to haunt him. The stories he'd kept private for so long, stories that could have destroyed careers and lives, became the truth he finally chose to share before he was gone. Rock Hudson, the heartthrob who lived in fear. Among all the stars who crossed Johnny Carson's stage, none embodied Hollywood's illusion more completely than Rock Hudson. To millions of women in the 1950s and 60s, he was the perfect man, tall, magnetic, and effortlessly charming. But behind that image was a man living in constant fear that one wrong question could expose his entire life. Hudson appeared on The Tonight Show several times, joking and flirting in the way audiences expected. Yet according to those who worked closely with Carson, every interview felt like walking a tightrope. Carson knew the truth: Hudson was gay, and so did much of Hollywood. What neither man could risk was saying it out loud. During that era, studios treated image as sacred property. Universal Pictures and Hudson's agent, Henry Wilson, went so far as to arrange a marriage for him to Wilson's secretary, Phyllis Gates, in 1955. It lasted barely 3 years, but it served its purpose. It silenced rumors and protected the studio's investment. Carson later described such arrangements as institutionalized lying, a system that forced people to pretend simply to survive. While he never judged Hudson for living that lie, he felt deeply disturbed by how entire industries conspired to maintain it. Hudson's tragic end in 1985 forced the public to confront the truth he had spent decades hiding. His death from AIDS-related complications made him one of the first major celebrities to die of the disease. And for the first time, the world saw him not as an icon, but as a man crushed by impossible expectations. Carson, then in his late 60s, reportedly wept after hearing the news. For him, it wasn't just the loss of a friend. It was the collapse of an entire Hollywood illusion. Hudson's passing, he later told a producer, made every lie I ever helped protect feel heavier. Cary Grant and the Secret of Bachelor Hall. Cary Grant was the definition of Hollywood elegance. The man every audience adored and every studio trusted to make romance look effortless. He was witty, confident, and so perfectly composed that even his flaws seemed designed. But Johnny Carson, who admired him deeply, knew that the smooth, unshakable image of Cary Grant was as carefully manufactured as any movie script. Behind the immaculate suits and dazzling smile was a man named Archibald Leach, someone who had built a life of control to protect a truth he could never share. For more than a decade, Grant lived with fellow actor Randolph Scott in a beach house in Santa Monica, a place Hollywood insiders jokingly called Bachelor Hall. Fan magazines published photos of them together, exercising in the yard, cooking breakfast, reading the paper in matching robes, moments that now seem strikingly intimate. At the time, those images were brushed off as harmless fun between two bachelors sharing expenses. But Carson, who knew the stories whispered around NBC, understood exactly what they meant. Those weren't just friends, he once told a colleague. That was a family the world wasn't ready to see. Grant and Scott's domestic life existed in plain sight, yet remained invisible to the public's understanding. Their home became a safe space away from studio handlers and photographers, where they could simply live. Two men who shared affection, humor, and the quiet rhythm of partnership. Still, the illusion had to continue. When executives began to fear the photographs looked too cozy, both men were pressured to stage new romances for the tabloids. It was the 1930s and 40s, the height of the studio system's control. Rumors of homosexuality could mean instant dismissal, contract termination, or blacklisting. Carson later said that interviewing Grant about his 5 marriages felt like pretending not to know the end of a story you've already read. On air, they laughed about love, women, and Hollywood glamour. Off air, Carson carried the uncomfortable knowledge that each of those marriages, from Virginia Cherrill to Diane Cannon, was, at least in part, a performance meant to protect the brand of Cary Grant. The real man had been trained by survival to smile through silence. When Bachelor Hall finally dissolved under studio pressure, Grant and Scott separated quietly but never stopped caring for each other. Even decades later, when Carson spoke of them, it was with sadness, not judgment. "They did what they had to do," he once confided to a producer. "The public loved the fantasy." And sometimes loving the fantasy meant burying the truth. Grant lived out his later years in relative peace, retiring from acting and becoming a father at 62. To the world, he remained the ultimate gentleman, eternally composed, eternally mysterious. But to those like Carson who knew what was sacrificed to create that image, his story was a quiet tragedy. A man so loved by millions who could never be loved freely by the one who truly mattered. It was, as Carson saw it, Hollywood's most beautiful lie, the one everyone wanted to believe. Katharine Hepburn and Spencer Tracy, the 26-year cover story. To the public, Katharine Hepburn and Spencer Tracy were Hollywood's eternal lovers, the perfect example of devotion that lasted a lifetime. For 26 years, their relationship was celebrated as proof that love could conquer anything, even the fact that Tracy never divorced his wife. But Johnny Carson, who interviewed Hepburn multiple times, came to understand how much of that story was theater. Behind the polite smiles and rehearsed anecdotes was an arrangement that protected them both. Hepburn had long defied the expectations of Hollywood women. She wore trousers when that was considered shocking, refused to play the press-driven romance game, and spent much of her life living privately in Connecticut. For her, Tracy offered cover, a reason for her independence that the gossip columns could accept. For Tracy, a devout Catholic battling alcoholism and guilt, Hepburn's companionship gave him stability and respectability. Carson would later tell close friends that he considered their story the most brilliant deception of all. It wasn't a lie born of shame, he said, but of necessity. Hepburn's most intimate companions were women, including her longtime confidant Laura Harding and later Phyllis Wilborn, whom she reportedly called her wife. Yet she never let the press see that part of her life. The legend of Kate and Spence served everyone, the studios, the tabloids, and an America hungry for a fairy tale. What fascinated Carson was how gracefully Hepburn turned survival into an art form, living partly in truth and partly in performance, never apologizing for either. Marlon Brando and James Dean, the rebels who couldn't be free. If Rock Hudson and Cary Grant were symbols of controlled glamour, Marlon Brando was chaos, the man who blew open acting itself. He was raw, restless, and revolutionary. But even Brando, the icon of truth on screen, hid parts of himself that Hollywood would never forgive. Carson found that contradiction fascinating. He saw an actor who preached authenticity while living under a veil of secrecy. During the 1950s and 60s, Brando's studios built his reputation as a ladies' man, the brooding genius who broke hearts and rules in equal measure. Yet Carson and many in Hollywood knew he had relationships with men as well as women. In private, Brando was open about his fluidity, but publicly he let the myth sell tickets. "The most honest actor alive," Carson once remarked privately, still had to lie to make a living. Then there was James Dean, the boy Brando was rumored to love, and the symbol of freedom Hollywood used to sell to youth. Dean's life was short, his career only 3 films, but his legend immortal. Carson heard from veterans of the studio system that Dean's path was not as romantic as the myth suggested. To survive in a world ruled by powerful men, Dean played the game the way many ambitious actors had to, using relationships to open doors. Rumors of his connection with director Rogers Brackett and others circulated for decades. Carson never condemned him. He saw Dean as a victim of a system that punished honesty and rewarded obedience. His early death at 24 froze him in time, forever the rebel, forever safe from exposure. Carson once said to a producer, "Maybe that's why he stayed an idol. He died before the truth could hurt him." In his eyes, Brando and Dean were two halves of the same story, brilliant men imprisoned by their own mythology. Marlon Brando and James Dean, the rebels who couldn't be free. If Rock Hudson and Cary Grant were symbols of controlled glamour, Marlon Brando was chaos, the man who blew open acting itself. He was raw, restless, and revolutionary. But even Brando, the icon of truth on screen, hid parts of himself that Hollywood would never forgive. Carson found that contradiction fascinating. He saw an actor who preached authenticity while living under a veil of secrecy. During the 1950s and 60s, Brando's studios built his reputation as a ladies' man, the brooding genius who broke hearts and rules in equal measure. Yet Carson and many in Hollywood knew he had relationships with men as well as women. In private, Brando was open about his fluidity, but publicly, he let the myth sell tickets. "The most honest actor alive," Carson once remarked privately, still had to lie to make a living. Then there was James Dean, the boy Brando was rumored to love and the symbol of freedom Hollywood used to sell to youth. Dean's life was short, his career only 3 films, but his legend immortal. Carson heard from veterans of the studio system that Dean's path was not as romantic as the myth suggested. To survive in a world ruled by powerful men, Dean played the game the way many ambitious actors had to, using relationships to open doors. Rumors of his connection with director Rogers Brackett and others circulated for decades. Carson never condemned him. He saw Dean as a victim of a system that punished honesty and rewarded obedience. His early death at 24 froze him in time, forever the rebel, forever safe from exposure. Carson once said to a producer, "Maybe that's why he stayed an idol. He died before the truth could hurt him." In his eyes, Brando and Dean were two halves of the same story, brilliant men imprisoned by their own mythology. Marlene Dietrich and Raymond Burr, Truth and Deception. Marlene Dietrich was unlike anyone Carson ever interviewed. Elegant, bold, and utterly self-possessed, she did not pretend to fit Hollywood's rules. Her European background allowed her a freedom few American stars enjoyed. She wore men's suits, sang in smoky cabarets, and treated gender and sexuality as part of her art. Carson admired her for it. "She made truth look stylish," he told a writer. Married on paper but independent in practice, Dietrich lived openly within Hollywood's shadows and never let shame touch her name. Then came Raymond Burr, the exact opposite. On screen, he was the unshakable defender of truth, Perry Mason himself. Off-screen, he lived inside one of the most elaborate fictions ever crafted. Burr claimed to have been married 3 times, to have lost a wife and child in a plane crash, and to have fought in World War II. None of it was true. It was a shield built to protect his career and his partner Robert Benavidez, whom he met on the set of Perry Mason in 1960. Carson found Burr's story heartbreaking. Here was a man who spent decades playing a defense lawyer dedicated to truth while living a lie to defend his own life. He described Burr's interviews as talking to a ghost of a man who was never allowed to exist. The contrast between Dietrich's bold honesty and Burr's painful fabrication captured for Carson the 2 ways Hollywood stars survived, by defying the rules or by being broken by them. Charles Laughton, Elsa Lanchester, and Tyrone Power, The Last Secrets. Charles Laughton and Elsa Lanchester were married for more than 30 years, and to the world, they looked like another classic Hollywood couple. But Carson knew their marriage was built on mutual protection. Both were gay, both brilliant, and both knew that being honest would mean the end of their careers. They created a partnership that was functional, kind, and free of pretense within its own walls. When Lanchester appeared on Carson's show years after her husband's death, she spoke with affection but avoided anything that could shatter the myth. To Carson, their story was not tragedy, but ingenious adaptation, a way to survive without betrayal. The same could not be said for Tyrone Power. He was the epitome of masculine beauty, the swashbuckler of a generation whose face alone sold tickets. But that beauty became his prison. Hollywood demanded that he belong to every woman who watched him on screen, and so the real man was never allowed to exist. Carson heard the stories from old studio hands. How Power's private life was painfully compartmentalized, how his 3 marriages served to quiet questions that could have ruined him. He died of a heart attack in 1958 at just 44, his truth buried with him. By the time Carson reflected on these lives in his final years, he no longer felt like a talk show host. He felt like a witness to a grand illusion, one that had entertained the world while destroying the souls of those inside it. He wasn't angry with Hollywood. He was sad for the people who had to hide so much just to be loved. In the end, Johnny Carson never used his platform to expose anyone. He chose kindness over scandal and understanding over revelation. Looking back, he saw those years as a lesson in human fragility, how fame can force a person to erase themselves just to survive. Which of these Hollywood stories shocked you the most? And which star do you think hid their truth with the most grace? Tell us below, and don't forget to subscribe for more untold chapters of Hollywood's golden age.